This is an FDA podcast. Today we're going to be talking to Dr. Paez Victor out of Toronto. She's a member of the Canadian Bolivarian Circle. She has a PhD in sociology from York University, and she's quite outspoken on Venezuelan democracy, Hugo Chavez, etc. What we'd like to discuss today is Venezuelan democracy, the upcoming presidential election in Venezuela next year, and also the amount and spread of hearsay against the Venezuelan government. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Victor. So, where are things at right now in Venezuela, would you say, in terms of its relation with the West and so forth?
Well, first of all, Venezuela is the West. Venezuela is in the Western Hemisphere. It is the country that I would say has the greatest democratic legitimacy in the continent. What we have in Venezuela is a thriving popular democracy. Let me just say something. If Venezuela's main product were potatoes, no power, no international government would care what happened there. The reality is that Venezuela's main product is petroleum. It is oil. And that is the heart of the matter. And the question is, who controls that oil? And who does that oil belong to? Does it belong to international multinational corporations? Does it belong to the rich developed countries? Does it belong to the United States? Or does it belong to the land and the people where the oil is? So that is really the fundamental, I would say, geopolitical question. For 40 years, Venezuela had been ruled by corrupt elites. And I think that it is important when you are trying to find out what is happening in the country right now, that people look at the history. Where have that people been? And the elites ruled Venezuela, controlled the oil and the immense amount of money that comes in through its sale. They were corrupt. They carried out a repressive pseudo-democracy for the last 40 years. And they used the oil for their own purposes. Hardly anybody paid taxes in Venezuela. And you had governments that had secret police, carried out torture, disappearances, illegal searches and arrests and raids. There was widespread abuse of human rights. There were displaced and abused indigenous peoples. There was utter disregard for the law. And in that rich country, where they have had, petroleum since the 1920s, 80% of the people were in poverty, and a quarter of them in extreme poverty. So now the Venezuelans have a popularly elected government who is trying to really, I would say, promote a very participatory democracy. And now the powers that be, particularly the United States and Canada and even Europe, are against this democratically elected government and try every possible way to discredit it.
How do you account for all the hearsay, how widespread it is against Chavez and his Venezuelan government? There's many people in the mainstream Western populations who have a negative view of Chavez because of the negative media portrayals that are coming out.
Yes. Well, first thing to remember is that the media in Venezuela is 95% in private hands. So this is an elite-owned media, and they speak English and French and German and whatever language, especially English, and they have the international connections. In Canada, just think, in Canada, all the news that comes to Canadians comes via the U.S. Media agencies, Reuters and United Press and all of that. There is not one Canadian newspaper or Canadian TV or radio that has a representative, a reporter stationed in Venezuela. Not one. So all the news that comes to Canadians is through the eyes of the United States. And so Canadians don't have a Canadian view. Because there are no Canadians down there giving this view, through reports and such. Every now and again, some reporter will go down there, and sometimes they don't even speak Spanish, and they come back with some sort of news. But so this is one of the important things that is going on, that the media, the international media, follows through this view of the opposition. Take, for example, the Inter-American Press Association. The Inter-American Press Association is very powerful. It's just issued a report last year, and this report was based entirely on opposition party material that was given to them. But the International Press Association is not an association of newspapermen, which is what you would thought it is, but it is an association of powerful media owners. These are the owners of the media. And it has never mentioned the numerous attacks that have been carried out against government, TV, and radio journalists in Venezuela. And it never condemned the 2002 coup d'etat against President Chavez in 2002. Take Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch released a report last year condemning Venezuela, and it was so inaccurate and it was so biased that 100 distinguished international experts signed a letter, an open letter, and I will quote. This open letter said, quote, "It does not even meet the most minimal standards of scholarship, impartiality, accuracy, or credibility." So, there are two things about Venezuela. One is the oil. There is a deadly fight going on about who will control the mineral resources of the world right now. We have seen this in Iraq, and we have seen in Libya. The second thing is that Venezuela's democracy and its achievements fly in the face of the liberal idea of trickle-down economics. It goes in the face of the whole neoliberal idea of deregulation and privatization and open markets in the sense of letting the corporations in. So it is a bad example. It is a bad example because it is an alternative to what President Chavez calls savage capitalism, which is this tremendous system which we now see is quite in crises both in the United States and in Europe. So the idea that Venezuela has been able to have a government that, first of all, is democratic, whose elections have been overseen by thousands of international observers throughout these last 12 years. And furthermore, it has achieved a country free of illiteracy, a country where there is medical care available to almost 95% of the people, a country that the UNESCO recognizes has no illiteracy, a country where they have actually lowered poverty. It went from almost 80%, and now it is about it's down to about 29%, and the extreme poverty, which had been a third of that 80% that was poor, is down to 7%. These are incredible, immense anti-poverty measures that have been recognized by entities such as the United Nations. This is a bad example. And Venezuela's foreign policy is also a bad example, because what Venezuela has promoted is the integration of South America. This is the famous ideal of Simon Bolivar. Do you want me to carry on?
No. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yes, by all means, continue on that. On Simon Bolivar.
Well, the basis of Venezuelan democracy, which, by the way, each election is with enormous voter turnout, almost overwhelming voter turnout, very rich democracy. But the basis of Venezuelan democracy are three pillars. One is civil human rights, political human rights, and these are embodied in the new constitution that was created in the year 2000, and it's one of the most progressive constitutions in the world.
We can confirm that, because the FDA did a study on the constitutional and legislative basis of Venezuela, and it received an 85% score. It came second out of 27 countries.
Wow.
Yes. Yeah. So we can definitely support what you're saying there.
We never had this before. A constitution solidly based on human rights, rights for women, rights for children. Even Canada hasn't, integrated the United Nations rights for children here. The rights of the environment, the rights of indigenous people. You know, the indigenous people had no rights in the previous constitutions. The rights of the environment. There are no political prisoners. Let me just say something about the Constitution. It was written by a constitutional assembly that was elected. So these people were elected directly so that they would sit down and write a constitution. And every single group they could imagine was represented there, women, environment, all of those. And they wrote it in a very simple way that anyone who speaks Spanish can actually read it. It wasn't sort of in legalese. But many of the people who were there writing the Constitution were people who had suffered by the previous governments. These were people who themselves had been thrown in jail, who were tortured, people whose families were disappeared or killed. So for them, the issue of human rights was very important. So you have, for example, one of the vice presidents of Venezuela, Rodriguez, who was vice president, quite recently. His father was actually tortured to death by one of the previous, supposedly, democratic government. So they took this human rights very, very seriously. But human rights in the Constitution is not just those civic rights, such as freedom of speech and assembly and all of that, but also social rights. And Canada believes in social rights. So these are the rights that obligate a government to provide for the needs of the people. So the government has to provide food security and access to medical care and access to education. These are very important. So that's the second pillar, the social human rights. And the third pillar that I was talking about is participatory democracy. It's not just a representative democracy. It's a participatory one. And that means democracy from bottom up. It's transferring power and resources to the grassroots to organize communities to solve their own problem. So let me talk a bit about the achievements of the Venezuelan democracy. It isn't just, oh, well, we have a good constitution. Sometimes laws are very well written down, but are they carried out? So, one of the first things that the government President Chavez did was it took control of the oil. The oil was supposedly nationalized, had been nationalized before, but the oil company of Venezuela had been entirely a toy of the elites, and President Chavez changed the board of directors and took control so that it was on the verge of being privatized. And there was a lot of corruption there. For example, a director of transport for the oil company would also be the owner of the trucks or the boats that would do the transportation. Here in Canada, we call that conflict of interest. There was no conflict of interest. There was all kinds of corruption carried out there. And then furthermore, the money that, this is quite extraordinary. People sometimes don't believe this, but it is true. The petroleum company of Venezuela actually had more money than the state, than the country of Venezuela, because they were using this money for all kinds of adventures. All of that is over. The Venezuelan oil now belongs to the people, and its money is used for those social programs and government services that the government feels is a social debt, that it is a debt that the government owes the people. The UN Development Program has congratulated Venezuela for its human rights record, and especially for reducing poverty and inequality, like I said before. Between 1998 and 2008, Venezuela reduced poverty by 44%. And what is really important, that it reduced inequality by 54%. And this has influenced organisms and organizations in the rest of Latin America. And between the same number of years, 98 to 2009, extreme poverty was reduced to 7%. There is a Human Development Index in the United Nations, and this one has increased 7 points during these years for Venezuela. And Venezuela is the country in Latin America that has the lowest inequality rate in Latin America. In education, one of its prime achievements is the eradication of illiteracy, and that it has achieved, is one of the few countries that has achieved the Millennium Goal in education, because 95% of the children go to school, and the dropout used to be almost 70% in some areas. So half the country right now is studying something or other. Out of a population of about 29 million or so, there's about 17 million students. There are all these misiones or missions where people are finishing primary school, finishing high school, preparing for university. Before there were a handful of universities, now there are quite a lot of them, particularly in every state, so looking to university. Healthcare, of course, is another. And healthcare is very interesting because it is one of the examples of the new type of interchange between countries that Venezuela wants to. Are you still listening to
Yes,
me?
I am, of course.
Sorry, okay,
Yeah.
sorry, I didn't know. Venezuela has two things to protect it. One is its people. It's people that go out voluntarily and freely and vote for their government. A very popular government. It's very hard for an outside power to come in and depose a popular government. The second thing is its neighbors. And Venezuela's foreign policy is indeed very important. One of the things that it has, and it has established this through ALIVA, an organization that I'll talk about a little bit later, but the first step towards that was its relationship with Cuba. Venezuela had oil, but it hardly had doctors or nurses. So it exchanges oil for doctors in Cuba. So Venezuela has 20,000 Cuban doctors, healthcare people, and they are the ones who established this mission called Barrio Adentro, which means into the neighborhood. And from the point of view of the Venezuelan woman who has several children and lives in a large, slum area, if her child woke up in the middle of the night with a fever, this was terrible. She would have to take this child, go down slopes because they are usually on the hills, try to get a vehicle to get her to the center of the city, to go into a huge bureaucratic hospital where there were hardly any beds and hardly any help, and try and be there hours until somebody saw her child. Now every single barrio or neighborhood has a little module of very good primary health care that is manned not by a nurse, but by a fully fledged expert Cuban doctor. And from that, a whole system of healthcare has evolved in Venezuela. This year alone, 26 new hospitals have been built, and 141 hospitals have been refurbished and modernized. And today, more than 70% in the past, 70% of the people had no access to health care. And now it's over 80% of the people have access to health care because they are there in the villages, in the indigenous areas, in the urban areas, in the rural areas. There is a doctor. And the aim is to create Venezuelan doctors to replace Cuban doctors. So there is a new curricula where doctors are trained with a different ideology. The ideology is not dissimilar to the Canadian one, which is health is not a business. Health is a human right. And if you become a doctor, you don't become a doctor so that you can get rich. You become a doctor so that you can serve your people. So there's a new school of medicine, of a new ideology as to why you should become a doctor. And right now, already, the first graduation has occurred, and many of the professors who are teaching this are also Cubans. And so now we have in the health system not just the Cuban doctors, but we have the new generation of Venezuelan doctors. I just want to say a little anecdote that when President Chavez became elected, he sits at his desk and he sees the disaster before him. And one of the things that was very close to his heart was when he realized that the overwhelming majority didn't have access to doctors. So he called for a campaign, and he said to Venezuelan doctors, come, join this humanitarian campaign. I need you to go out there where the people are in this idea for Barrio Adentro. And you know how many Venezuelan doctors showed up? 53. So you can imagine, with 53 doctors, he could do nothing.
Yes.
And so then he came up with this idea. We have oil. Let's trade oil with Cuba. We'll give oil, and it's something like 90,000 barrels a day, and Cuba sends 20,000. And these are not 20,000 medical students. These are 20,000 doctors with postgraduate degrees and with experience in countries, because the Cubans give health care to half of the Caribbean and many of the African countries. The other thing about the democracy that is very important is that the government has tried to democratize the radio-electric spectrum. The media is against him, TV and radio, and they say all kinds of things, and yet the government of Hugo Chavez has not closed one single TV station, not one radio. And what has happened is that he has promoted community radio and TV. So 95% of the media is still in private hands. But by fostering and helping the growth of community radios, instead of closing it, we now have a situation that if in 1998 the private radio was about 300. Now there are 466. And in 1998, there was no community radio whatsoever. Today, there are 243. The same thing with TV. There are now more private TVs, from 32 to 61. And there was no community TV. And now there are 37 community TV stations. Now, this is really important because the voice of the neighborhoods and the areas are now being heard because they control a radio, they control a TV, and they put on the programs that they themselves want to hear, not the ones that an elite wants to hear. Venezuelan TV and radio was such that they would have, those soap operas, and the soap operas would have caricatures of the people of Venezuela. These are not the way they live or having the values which they feel. And then the third, I would say, column of Venezuelan democracy is this participatory democracy. And its basis is the constitutionally recognized and endowed communal councils. Now, historically, in Venezuela, municipal governments were very corrupt because they were dominated by the local elites. So the communal councils, which are inspired by the organization of the indigenous peoples of Venezuela, are harnessing social energy and creativity and enthusiasm. It's a sort of self-government, and it's a way in which people, communities, can oversee the government because that's the only way to stop corruption. Corruption isn't something that just occurs in the government. Corruption has historically happened in the region, and it was everywhere, particularly in the private sector. So what the communal councils do is allow the communities and the people to take part in the decisions that affect them. They're really transforming political and social life. One author said that it was one of the most deeply democratic movements in history.
Interesting.
So what happens is that in rural areas, families of about 20 families can form, at least 20 families can form a communal council, and in the urban areas, anywhere between 200 and 400. And they are part of the communal council. It's small scale, so people can exercise power, and they bring together all the different organizations that are working locally and to plan what the community needs. They're the ones who say, these are the problems, or these are the things that our community is struggling with, and these are the solutions that we want for them. And there's direct funding for them. There's a bank for the communal councils. And I think that the latest I have read is that the budgets are about $28,000 per project. They have to present, the projects that they need. And we're talking about building schools, building houses, waterworks, parks, water treatment plants, paving roads, and even there's a system of what they call socialist industries, and they're all controlled by these community councils. Now, here's the interesting thing, that you still have municipal councilors. You still have municipal officials. But what happens now is that those municipal councils, the mayors and the councilors and their officials, have to work with and through the communal councils. They have to elaborate their budgets with the communal councils. And the communal councils have had varying degrees of success here and there, of course, but they're widely popular. They're becoming the backbone of urban and rural planning. And it's a way to oversee and control corruption.
Interesting. I wanted to put this all in context now. You started off talking about oil. And that's the primary reason that there's a lot of Western countries interested in Venezuela and interested in undermining its democracy. Having said that, what do you see as the future of Venezuela, and how will it be able to withstand the pressure for like the U.S., the country like the U.S. that wants oil, that needs oil, and they will do almost anything to get it, as shown in Libya, as shown in Iraq. Could you touch on that?
Yes, it is the gravest threat, not only to Venezuela but to the entire region, because any kind of destabilization of Venezuela will bring about a regional conflict just like we have in the Middle East. And a very serious situation has been, it's gone on for 200 years. Huh? I mean, the United States aggression against Latin America, it's a whole host of coups d'etats, of assassinations of progressive leaders, of every single brutal dictatorship in Latin America has been backed by the United States. Economic sabotage, blockades like the one against Cuba, diplomatic harassment, especially of the smaller countries in Central America, international smearing like they're doing to President Chavez, electoral frauds, campaigns. They've got people down there who are experts on elections. All of this has been happening for 200 years. But lately, the increased U.S. militarization of Latin America is profound. First of all, they have activated the Fourth Fleet. The Fourth Fleet was suspended after the Second World War. Now they have brought it back to life, and this Fourth Fleet has any number of ships of all kinds of sizes, and they go up and down the subcontinent, just showing their might. Of course, nobody can go against the United States. They are the superpower, right? But not only that, they have placed at least 7 to 10 military and naval bases in Colombia. They own Colombia, by the way. Colombia has already lost any kind of sovereignty. And all Latin American affairs have now passed to the, I would say, the decisions of the U.S. Military Southern Command. So they have become now security issues. And thus they bypass the State Department, which had at least some minimal democratic elements to it because it had to go through Congress. So right now, it is the Pentagon who decides U.S. policy in South America. This is very serious. And then, of course, all the monies that they are channeling to the opposition groups, supposedly to support democracy there. That this includes Canada, who is doing the same thing. So how can Venezuela subsist? How can Venezuela stand all of this? Well, now, I'll tell you how. One is, of course, the fact that it is a very popular government, that its people are 100% with the government, and if anything should happen, if they should kill him like they did Allende, the only way that you could do this, you could control Venezuela by getting rid of this government, is to have a very, very despotic dictatorship and govern with an iron rule like Pinochet did. But the second thing is that Venezuela has an incredible foreign policy. The foreign policy of Venezuela has been Latin American integration. This is the ideal, the dream of Simón Bolívar, the great liberator, the liberator of Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru, the one who vanquished the Spanish Empire 200 years ago. And before, it used to be, oh, yes, we are brother nations. Oh, yes, we are all, together. That was false. Each of these countries was divided, and each of these countries was weary of each other, and each of these countries looked to the United States for every single need that they had. For ketchup, from ketchup to minerals or whatever they needed. So now, with the Latin American integration, Venezuela says, the patria, the homeland, is our America. We have to strengthen our America. And this is what the Bolivarian movement has been. And now, of course, you know there are 10 Latin American democratic elected countries in Latin America who lean towards the left and not the right. But they needed an infrastructure. So what has Venezuela, I would say, has been the leader in promoting? First of all, Telesur. Telesur is the television of South America, where someone in Venezuela can be watching their TV of something that's happening in the Congress of Argentina, for example. Before, the way the countries had of knowing what is happening in each of their countries was through CNN. There was no other way. So Telesur is the union of all the state TVs of South America. And it has had an incredible impact because now Latin American countries can watch on TV what is happening and their voices, their own expression of their views there. So that's Telesur. Second of all, ALBA. ALBA is an organization right now, has about, I think, 12 members. And this is the organization that killed the free trade agreement that President Bush wanted to have. Free trade agreements are all about commerce, are all about making money. And she can come in and sell you whatever it is that we make at, a third of the price that you can make. Whereas the ALBA says, no, we have to unite. We have to help each other for all kinds of interchange. But the purpose is not for us to make money necessarily, but for us to help our people out of misery and poverty. So through ALBA, for example, you have Venezuela, whose agriculture is terrible because for 40 years it was neglected. And so it can give oil to Nicaragua, and Nicaragua can send experts on cattle raising and agricultural expertise. And so they kind of barter or trade. And ALBA now has its own currency, which is called the sucre, in which they are able to trade with each other without having to buy dollars. Then the other important part of this infrastructure of uniting Latin America is UNASUR. UNASUR is the Organization of Defense of Latin America. And what UNASUR has done, and it includes countries like Argentina and Brazil and Colombia, even Colombia, which is a right-wing government. And what UNASUR has done is told the United States the Monroe Doctrine is dead. The Monroe Doctrine of the United States said basically Latin America is our backyard and we are in charge of its defense. UNASUR tells the United States and the world that the defense of Latin America lies in the hands of the Latin American countries. An example of this is that a few years ago, under President Bush, Rumsfeld came to, was invited to a meeting of the defense ministers of Latin America, and in it he wanted the Latin American defense ministers to agree that Latin America was part of the war against terrorism. And the Latin American defense ministers, with one voice, told Rumsfeld and Bush, there is no terrorism in Latin America, and we will have nothing to do with your war on terror. There are local problems. There are guerrillas in Colombia, but that is not the terrorism that the United States was talking about. And they don't call those terrorists. That's an ideological war that's going on, a civil war that's going on in Colombia. So we have ALBA, we have UNASUR, we have Telesur, we have the Banco del Sur. Now, what does the Banco del Sur and the Bank of ALBA and the Bank of the South have done? What they have done is vanquished those international pirates, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. The Latin American countries have been beggars, have had to go on bended knee to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to ask for loans. And of course, they're invited to come and get loans, but the loans always came with strings. oh, you will get this money, but you have to open the doors to international markets. You have to open the doors to international consultants. You have to allow this free trade of goods, etc. So now the Latin American countries can obtain monies from each other through these southern banks, the Bank of the South, the Bank of Alba, and nobody is going to tell their governments, oh, but to get this money you have to change this or that domestic policy. This has had a profound impact, especially on the International Monetary Fund. And then there is Petrosur and Petrocaribe. Now, this is very rich. The United States often throws out that Venezuela, oh, how dare they? They are using petroleum for their own purposes. Well, yes, it's true. Not that the United States hasn't done all kinds of things of the sort. But what Venezuela does with its petroleum is, instead of browbeating other countries, it has gone to the very, very poor Caribbean islands and it said, you are very poor. You are going to be able to buy Venezuelan oil at a special price. So they have to put up front 25% of the cost of the petroleum. And then the rest they can pay for 50 years. They can pay or something like that, almost 50 years, with not with usury or tremendous, interest, very, very low. So, of course, this means that these countries are grateful to Venezuela. The Caribbean countries then vote for Venezuela very, very often now because they are getting something very valuable. The United States has done nothing of this sort at this level for the poor countries of the Caribbean. And Petrosur is again another way of creating this infrastructure of Latin American integration. Petrosur is the union of the national oil companies of South America. And what is behind it is this idea. We have oil, and we are in the necessity right now of selling that oil to the rich countries so that they can carry on their lavish, super consumptive lifestyle. Whereas we're going to need this oil so that we can reach a level of development that can meet important and basic needs of our country so that we can actually feed our people, not just have Walmarts at every corner like happens in the rich countries.
Right.
So Petrocaribe is very important because it's the union of these petroleum companies of the South, which are then helping each other to, for example, create refineries. There's now refineries between Venezuela and Brazil. Before there weren't these kinds of exchanges and help, mutual help. And then there is CELAC. CELAC is it's called the Community of Latin American Countries. And what they want to do is they want to put a nail in the coffin of the Organization of American States, because the Organization of American States is an embarrassment. It has always been the tool with which the United States has diplomatically harassed the Latin American countries. And CELAC and the Group of Rio, these are Latin American governments, and not all of them on the left. They're varying, degrees there, although most of them right now are on the left, who have said, you know what, we are going to solve our problems, and we're going to solve it without North America. So in CELAC, neither the United States nor Canada were invited to be part of that, because they say, we in Latin America, we're going to solve our own problems, and we don't need the Organization of American States, which is basically has been an instrument of domination for them. So again, the foreign policy of Venezuela, helping to create this structure. And by the way, Mercosur was also affected, because Mercosur was first set out to be, a strictly commercial market, and that also has changed to try and gear it towards the kind of products and services that people really need, rather than aiming it towards some international global market. So it is understood that this threat of the United States, which, by the way, Simon Bolivar alerted Latin America to 200 years ago, we believe that that is the strength of Venezuela, its people and its neighbors.
Interesting.
And, of course, its wider neighbors, too, because Venezuela has, before, didn't give very much, the previous governments didn't care much about their relationship with other countries in the world. And now Venezuela has relationships with India and China and Belarus and Russia and countries like that before it hardly had any kind of significant exchange. In other words, Venezuela has friends, and Venezuela has a very, very engaged and politically savvy people. It's a bit about the famous cliche about the toothpaste. When a country has huge political consciousness of its position in the world and its role as an actor in the political sphere, it's very hard to then tell that people now don't think anymore, don't try to act in politics anymore. So Venezuela right now is I really invite you to go down there so that you can see the dynamics, the creativity, the enthusiasm that is there that never was before. I'll tell you a little anecdote if I still have time.
Yes, you do. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, I was in a very poor barrio of Venezuela, quite large and very poor, up and down these little hills, houses, rickety houses. But the people there were very organized, and they were showing me their medical facilities, the barrio adentro, and all their different committees to help clear the streets and clean them and etc. And then we were sitting on this dirt road, and we started talking about international politics. And I couldn't believe the level of sophistication of the people who had not only just read today's newspaper, but seemed to understand what was happening in the world. I think at that time there was an invasion of Iraq going on, and I was thinking, I can't believe it. Here I am, I've got 3 university degrees, and I am carrying out a highly sophisticated political conversation with people who live in this, very poor section. So that political consciousness that has occurred in Venezuela through their education that has come up, through the discussions that are carried out in the communal councils, through their awareness that they live in a country where their government is constantly under siege by forces outside and forces inside, because they never forget that their president was kidnapped and came within minutes of being shot, and that their government, which they had voted in, was overthrown for 48 hours by an elite that in those 48 hours eradicated the Constitution, dismissed Parliament, got rid of all the major ministers, and they don't forget this. So there is something quite wonderful happening there. It's not that everything's perfect in a country such as Venezuela, in a region which is still steeped in many, many necessities, but it is what the Venezuelans have chosen. And I think that in the end, that is, if you are really a Democrat, if you truly believe that democracy is better than dictatorship, that democracy is what the world really needs, then you have to then respect the will of the sovereign Venezuelan people. And that's what really matters, that the Venezuelan people think positively of their own government. When they've expressed this formally by electing and re-electing the government of President Chavez in clean, transparent, efficient election process that is the process that is the most internationally observed in the world. Jimmy Carter has been there at every one of these elections and has said so. And they have also expressed it in international polls that show consistently that Venezuelans are among the Latin Americans that most highly regard their democracy, and they have one of the highest ratings of happiness and contentment with their future.
Yeah.
Believe that their future problems will be solved.
Yeah, Dr. Victor, having said that about Venezuela, I should add that the FDA has been invited to observe the next presidential election down there. So we will be down there observing.
Excellent.
Yeah, but, getting to the issue of democracy and Venezuelan democracy, what do you think about the U.S. and European and the Canadian governments and the establishments that they continually disrespect Venezuelan democracy and the will of the people, yet by the same token they preach democracy and human rights? How do you reconcile that contradiction?
I don't reconcile it at all. It's a huge hypocrisy. They use the rhetoric of democracy to promote their own very narrow political and economic interests. What is Canada's interest in Latin America that Mr. Harper now is talking about, this new policy towards Latin America, which he has? Yes, it is new. The other governments previous to his didn't have it. But his interest is not to help Latin American countries overcome misery and poverty and all of that. It's to advance the Canadian mining industry. That is the sole purpose of the conservative government's new line towards Latin America. And the second of all is, and this is very sad for me as a Canadian to say, Canada had always, up to now, no matter how close it was to the United States, always had a certain pride that its foreign policy was its own. After all, Canada continues to have good relationships with Cuba. It continues to have had good relations with China, even though the United States, was all against that. That's all gone, That's all gone.
Yeah.
What we have now is what Linda is a famous writer, Linda McQuaig, says Canada is holding the bully's coat. Canada is going in to do some of the dirty work for the United States and Latin America. This is very sad for me. Very sad.
Yeah.
The United States, of course, is pouring through the National Endowment of Democracy. And this has been revealed, by the way, if you look up Fride Institute, Fride, this is an institute in Spain, which is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. They have issued a report. Actually, they haven't issued the report. It has been obtained May of this year, of last year. And they openly say that different international agencies have given $40 to $50 million to opposition groups in Venezuela. These include political parties, Primero Justicia, Nuevo Tiempo, and COPEI. They've been doing this since the year 2001. The coup was orchestrated by the United States. There's now all kinds of evidence of that obtained through freedom of information.
And ironically,
this 66 million have been given by NED and USAID and the Republican International Institute and the Soros Institute, which is called Open Society. And, of course, the Europeans have jumped in on this. The European Commission gives 6 to 7 million euros each year. This year, 3 million euros have been given to the NGOs to fight the elections. And they channel all this through these small NGOs, which most of them are virtual, which they've even admitted that they're virtual organizations. And they give it to these supposed civil society. And this includes the Pan American Foundation for Development and all of these. And they do it against Venezuelan laws. And they go down there with this money in foreign currency and then exchange it in the black market so they can have a double hit to Venezuela, because by doing this, they undermine the economy. And right now, the focus is on youth. So of the 15 million Venezuela quite recently, 32% of it is to youth groups and student groups, and even to the Catholic University of Caracas, which to my shame is my alma mater, and it is the center of the anti-democratic students. By the way, this is something that people here don't understand, because we live in such a stable, such a stable political system. In Canada, the opposition is called Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. Opposition governments here are part of the parliamentary system. They wouldn't do things to undermine the basic, I would say, rules and institutions of Canada. But in Venezuela, with very, very few exceptions, the opposition is anti-democratic. They don't believe in democracy. They were all in on the coup d'etat that nearly killed the president.
So was Carter. Carter actually said recently that he actually agreed with the coup. He would have supported it.
Imagine that.
Imagine that, but also, but doesn't this link back into the values of these people running these Western societies?
Oh, absolutely.
How would you describe their values? Because it's sugar-coated with democracy and human rights, but what would you say is at its core?
The United States and its minions, its a plethora of organizations, use the rhetoric of democracy. They still think that they're out there fighting for democracy. Show me one place where the United States and its instruments have actually created democracy, when in fact what they've done is backed hideous elites and dictatorships. Particularly, I don't want to talk about the rest of the world because I'm not an expert on those things, but I can tell you what has happened in Latin America. And so one of the strong things about CELAC and Sur and ALBA is that they have said no more coups. You know what they say, that there hasn't been a coup in Washington, D.C. because there's no American embassy in Washington, D.C. because the American embassies throughout the region are the places where money, arms, and strategic help comes to all the opposition parties of those governments which they deem are against them. It is a huge hypocrisy. We live in the era of the lie. We live in an era where international leaders will say one thing but really mean another, and another in a very sinister and oppositional way. But Latin America, I wish that you could read the websites and the articles and the press that is there. In Latin America, they are not deceived. In Latin America, people are very, very aware because of the terrible, terrible background that Latin Americans have had of this North American oppression that has been their plight to have witnessed and suffered. So right now, I believe that American democracy is in great danger. They who like to go around like Jimmy Carter being the judges of other people's democracy don't look at themselves and see what is happening there, where you see a society obsessed with security to such an extent that now the latest thing is they're even killing their own citizens, supposedly because they're terrorists. A society where bias and terrible cliches and racism against, for example, Muslim people is rampant, and not to mention the racial wars in the United States. This is terrible for the democracy in the United States. I am sure that the elections of Bush would have been contested if they had occurred in another country. Who can understand how the elections in the United States are? Who can understand that?
We actually did a study on electoral fairness study on the U.S. federal democracy, similar to what we did on Venezuela. Venezuela, as mentioned, received an 85% score. The U.S. received a 30% score. Basically, through its constitutional and legislative basis, we are able to show that it's basically a two-party dictatorship.
Well, I am so pleased to hear that, because I must read your report, because when they have elections there, one is baffled. Who is electing these people? What are these colleges? How can it be that every state has a different way of carrying out the elections? And here I want to talk about Canada. Canada is, in that sense, is a light to the world, because we have Elections Canada, and the elections in Canada are so organized and so transparent that when you compare it to the United States, you realize up here we're a Cadillac, and down there it's a jalopy.
But there are serious issues in Canadian democracy as well.
Yes.
You could argue that the major media is in bed with the government and corporations. And then when you look at electoral finance, it's favoring the large established parties.
Yes. Well, I agree with what you're saying, but I mean in general, the actual logistics of the actual elections as well.
Right.
I totally agree with what you're saying.
I just want to touch on this before we close off. Like, some of the hearsay and criticism against Chavez, like, could you briefly just touch, like, so some of the criticism is that the Venezuelan government is investing abroad, and then I find that an absurd criticism, because Western governments invest abroad all the time, and the U.S. corporations are global. The Canadian, a lot of the big Canadian companies are global. The second one is the issue of crime in Caracas. Some of the criticism is blaming Chavez. It seems like such a narrow argument to actually blame him for the crime in the city. Dr. Victor?
Well, the first one about investing abroad is ridiculous, and I don't think it even merits any talk. I will tell you, on the contrary, one of the greatest investments has been investment in its people, investment in education, investment in healthcare, investment in roads, investment in its own land and people. Its nationalization, the nationalization of the large, important industries. This is investment in Venezuela. Just right now, the government has nationalized gold mining because of the terrible things that it has done to the environment and to the human rights of indigenous peoples. And since they couldn't control these large corporations and the small miners that also do a lot of damage, the government has nationalized gold mining in Venezuela. This is taking control and command of the resources of its country for the good of its people. It may have investments abroad, but another thing that Venezuela has done, immediately when they saw that they took away Gaddafi's money that he had in banks in Europe, what President Chavez has done is recalled all the gold that Venezuela had in foreign banks. So all that, this was criticized also. How dare he take back his gold? But that's exactly what Venezuela has done. This gold is now in the basement of Venezuela's central bank, where it should have been always. And I'll tell you, I remember when that gold was taken out of Venezuela. It was taken out at midnight, but on the whim of the president of the bank of that sort. And when it was found out, he actually had the nerve to tell the newspapers that were there for anyone to go and look in the archives. He said, "Oh no, we're sending this gold to Europe and the United States so it'll be cleaned." So you can imagine how the elite played with the treasure of Venezuela. Now President Chavez has recalled all of Venezuela's gold, and it has come back to the country. And it has invested in some international or somewhere in another country. I bet you that where he has invested is in Latin American countries, because this is what he is encouraging. He is saying, we've got to invest in our own countries. We've got to help each other with expertise and funds and everything. So it's ridiculous for anyone to criticize that. As for crime, crime has become important. This is, they think, is the Achilles heel of the Bolivarian government. Look, crime is terrible, and it has been rampant in in the region. But when I have looked at the statistics on crime, and I'm sorry I don't have them here right now, I could send you some by email, international groups have seen that there is a greater crime in Central America and in Mexico. Well, in Mexico, we have read the horrors there because of the drug, the rampant drug cartels that are there. In Venezuela, we have had crime for a long time. But what you are hearing are the voices of people who want, law and order. You grab these bad guys and you put them in jail forever. And what the government is trying to do is, first of all, look at the causes of crime. So you have to work at lowering poverty. You have to work at education. You have to work at these long-term things, which are really important. You also have to work at eliminating the mafias of drug. And Venezuela has high esteem of the narcotics agencies because of the number of narcotics that it has confiscated and the number of these drug people that it has obtained. Most of them are Colombian, and so what they do is they send them back to Colombia. And the third thing is that Venezuela, and this is really, I'm so happy to talk about this. In Venezuela, you'd see a police and you'd really be afraid of them. They were thugs, the police. The police were just thugs with a gun. Nobody esteemed or had any kind of estimation of the police. Now the police have a university. They have 2 years of learning about human rights. They are learning about preventative measures. They are learning about community policing. Just this year, 3,000 of them have been graduated. 11% of them are women police, which is we had 1 or 2 women police, giving out, traffic violations before. And so the government has centralized the police and has given them a police academy, which we didn't have before. Before, every little mayor had his own police force. So you can imagine the chaos that was. And opposition voted against this. The opposition fought this. They wanted to retain their little feudal police. It was the police of Caracas, of the mayor of a section of Caracas, who was the one that fired upon the people which were unarmed during the coup. So the government said, no more of this. We're going to have, and there are police forces of the world have come to Venezuela to help Venezuela create this new police force, which is now not repressive. And now we have what was called the community policing, which is the police is going to be overseen by the community also. The communal councils will be working hand in hand with the police rather than have, like a small little army there trying to go against them. So this is a wonderful event. Now, I am sorry for people who have been victims of crime, and I'm not belittling crime. Nobody wants crime. But you can't turn around and say, this government is easy on crime, this government wants crime, or this government is doing things to promote crime. On the contrary, it is trying to fight a very long-standing cancer that there is in the entire region and in Venezuela. But the statistics are going down, fortunately, and of course they attribute this because they are trying to attack the actual causes that make people turn to crime rather than to a profitable and honest work.
Hey, Dr. Victor.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, but it would seem to me that...
Hello?
Dr. Victor? Hello?
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, Dr. Victor, it would seem to me that one of the causes of the crime is the international funding of opposition and anti-Chavez groups in Venezuela who are polarizing the country.
Well, you have hit it right on the nail. Now I'm going to talk to you about something very sinister. And that is that the United States has a National Ground Intelligence Center. And in 2006, through Freedom of Information, it confirmed that there is Group 4 of psychological operations active in Venezuela. And what this means that there are groups that are linked to paramilitaries. The paramilitaries are linked to Colombia and to these CIA operations in which they want to create chaos in Venezuela. There was recently a train derailment in Venezuela, which has never happened before. Already the suspicion is this was sabotage. There is sabotage of the electric system, where all of a sudden there are these blackouts that can't be explained technologically because these are part of this psychological operations against Venezuela. There have been crimes, there have been terrible crimes that have been carried out by people that are linked to these paramilitaries. And we believe that these are all part of this, what they have a particular name for it, the U.S. Army Ground Intelligence Center use marketing and advertising tactics and these expertise which they have from all of these guerrilla and undermining that they have done in the Middle East. They are carrying out those tactics in Venezuela. Don't be surprised if this electoral year, which, by the way, Chavez can't lose this election. The opposition has no unified program or candidate, and even the opposition pollsters are saying that. But don't be surprised this year if you will find, horrible crimes all of a sudden being committed in the country, or big accidents of some sort. And all of these are to undermine the confidence that Venezuelans have in their own government, so that people can then turn around the opposition and say, look how inept they are, They can't keep the trains running. They can't keep the lights running. Last year it was saying that they had electricity, that they couldn't run the electricity grid, and that this is so terrible, because one of the things about electricity in Venezuela is that now entire communities that never had electricity now have electricity. So of course the demands have gone up. The same thing with the transport. Now all kinds of people are able to use the trains and the buses. So yes, there are these more sinister forces at play, not just the propaganda. They are now going into situations where you can see violence. Look at the money they're giving to the students and the youth groups. What do these youth groups do? They go out and burn cars and block cities, streets, and they do all these what's called guarimbas, which is violent. They're giving money to the youth to go out and create chaos in the streets. This is not democracy. This is not the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to fight clearly in an election, in a campaign, and whoever wins, you're supposed to let them govern. This is not happening. Yeah. And one of the things that has happened to the Venezuelan government, I really feel for them, is that they have been allowed to govern, because all the time they're fighting on two fronts. They have to be watching their back all the time because of the internal elites that are in there to bring this government down which way, and of course the external ones to which they are linked. The Venezuelan elites are despicable. They are fascists and they are racist. And I say this with great sorrow because I was born in Venezuela and studied in Venezuela and have had a lot to do with the Venezuelan elites. And I can tell you that they despise their own people. The kind of words that they use to describe the president, who looks like someone that they would have employed to clean their backyard, is terrible. The way they talk about the people of Venezuela being incapable of being monkeys that don't know the first thing about government is shameful. And so these elites, which are racist and fascist politically, what they want to do is get rid of Chavez so that they can then be the ones to control the oil of Venezuela and make all the money that they made during all those years by being the poodles of international finance and international corporations. they are very despicable.
Yeah, interesting. I just want to touch on this one last criticism that's quite rampant in Western societies and probably in Venezuela as well. It's criticism saying that the electoral system's being undermined through computer technology, computer fraud. And I should add that there's been no evidence from international observers whatsoever which would support that. Yet it's circulating in Western society. And could you touch on that?
Yes, I think the system of Venezuela is fantastic because it not only has the physical one where people will put their hands on it, their thumbs and whatnot, but it also has the written one that's in the computer. So you're going to have a computer record of the vote, not of the person, because it's all anonymous. And it's been fantastic. It went from a country where the votes were boxes and little slips of paper here and there. They got lost or stuffed or whatever. A complete rampant frauds that went on in the past to a very serious outfit. They are impartial. I have been reading and hearing all the things that these people that run the elections of Venezuela, they have done it in the most professional way, and they have that double backing. That is that the computer system will also have a paper, I would say, witness to what has happened. And I dare anyone to compare the system of Venezuela with the system in the United States, and you will see that that is just an incredible system. I'm so glad that your foundation is going down there to review this, because although there might be glitches here and there, as they always are anywhere, you will see that the system is very clear, very transparent, and quite frankly, very hard to create a fraud. And as you rightly said, there has not been any of the international observers to have denounced the Venezuelan elections. These are just lies. This is part of that marketing propaganda. You just say a lie, never mind, repeat it over and over again, and people will believe it. So this is, and as I said, even Jimmy Carter has come out saying no, that the elections were well done. So at the last presidential elections, there were more than 300 international observers there. How many international observers were there in the United States with the election of Obama or Bush or any one of those? Zero, because the United States doesn't allow international observers there. Venezuela opens its doors and says, come in and see us, warrants and all, to see whether there is any fraud here. So I take great exception to that propaganda lie out there. And as I said, I am delighted that you're going down there so see for yourself how elections are conducted in Venezuela.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, it does. We're
asking about Simón Bolívar. Did you?
Pardon me?
Did you say you were going to ask me about Simón Bolívar?
No. We're going to have to close this off now.
Right.
Dr. Victor, I want to thank you so much for sharing your insight. For those people listening, the FDA podcast can be downloaded